I remember reading a news article once about an elderly woman in Florida who had lost her home of 40 years to a deed fraud scheme. She had been recovering from hip surgery when a distant relative, someone she hadn't spoken to in a decade, had forged her signature on a quitclaim deed and sold the house right out from under her. By the time she found out, the new owners had already changed the locks. The comments beneath that article were filled with the kind of outrage that only comes from reading about a cruelty so complete it seems impossible. How does something like that even happen? How can someone do that to their own family? I remember thinking the same thing when I read it. I remember setting my coffee cup down on my kitchen table and shaking my head and feeling that particular kind of sadness that comes from learning the world is capable of more darkness than you previously accounted for. Then I turned the page and went on with my day, because terrible things happen to other people, and the distance between their suffering and yours always seems vast until the morning it isn't. That article came back to me on a Thursday in October, 11 weeks after I had been loaded into an ambulance from my own backyard, when I walked through the glass doors of Piedmont Title and Escrow Services in downtown Asheville, North Carolina, with my attorney Robert Fitch at my left side and a Buncombe County Sheriff's deputy at my right, and looked across the closing table at my son Wayne and his wife Pamela and watched their faces drain of every last drop of color. The buyers, a young couple named the Hendersons who had done nothing wrong and knew nothing about what was really happening, sat in confused silence while their agent tried to figure out why a woman in a wool coat and walking cane had just handed the escrow officer a court injunction halting the sale of the house they believed they were about to purchase. My house. The house my late husband Gene built his life around. The house where my grandchildren had their first Christmases and learned to ride bicycles in the driveway and carved their initials into the oak doorframe of the back porch when they thought I wasn't looking. The house I had been lying in a hospital bed fighting to stay alive in while my son had quietly listed it, accepted an offer, and brought it within 48 hours of closing. But here's what Wayne didn't know when he stood up from that table, his voice cracking with a story about signatures and power of attorney and misunderstandings. He didn't know that his 72-year-old mother, the woman he had told the nursing staff at Laurel Ridge Rehabilitation Center was too fragile for visitors and too confused for phone calls, had spent the last 3 weeks of her recovery doing something very different from lying quietly in bed. She had been building a case. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand what that house means in order to understand what they tried to take. My name is Dorothy Callahan. Most people call me Dot. I was a middle school English teacher for 31 years in the Buncombe County public school system, and before that I was a girl who grew up in a small house in Black Mountain with parents who taught me that the two most important things you could leave behind in this world were a good name and a paid-off piece of land. My father worked at the furniture mill and my mother kept the books for 3 businesses in town, and by the time I was 8 years old I understood that a roof over your head that belonged to no bank was a kind of freedom that money alone couldn't buy you. Gene Callahan came into my life when I was 26 and he was 28 and we were seated next to each other at a school board dinner that neither of us particularly wanted to attend. Gene was a civil engineer with a quiet manner and patient eyes and the kind of steadiness you recognize immediately as rare. We were married 14 months later in my parents' backyard with 50 people and a borrowed tablecloth, and I have never once in my life doubted that it was the best decision I ever made. We bought the house on Maple Hill Road in North Asheville in 1983, when the neighborhood was still largely overlooked and the price reflected that. It was a 1924 craftsman bungalow on nearly an acre of land, with a deep front porch, original hardwood floors, a kitchen that had been updated twice in 60 years, and a backyard that backed up to a stand of old hemlocks that Gene spent the rest of his life tending the way some men tend to golf courses. We were not wealthy people. We were careful people. We paid the mortgage in full by 1997, and Gene died in his armchair in the front room in May of 4 years ago, after 41 years of marriage, and he left me with that house, a reliable pension, a small investment account, and more grief than I knew what to do with. The grief had softened by the time any of this happened. Not disappeared, but softened into something livable. I had my routines. I had my garden. I had my book club on Tuesday evenings and my walking group on Wednesday mornings, and my neighbor Marvella Green, who had moved in next door 11 years ago after her own divorce and who had become, over the course of countless shared meals and back porch conversations, something closer to a sister than a neighbor. I had my grandchildren, Lily and Cooper, who came to stay with me for 2 weeks every summer and who I adored with the particular intensity that grandparents understand and parents sometimes find alarming. I was not a lonely woman, and I was not a naive one. I had spent 31 years reading 14-year-olds closely enough to know when I was being told what someone wanted me to believe rather than what was true. But there is something about loving your own child that makes the warning signals harder to read clearly. You want so badly for the story they're telling you to be real that you look for every possible reason to believe it. I want you to keep that in mind as I tell you what happened next. Wayne had always been the kind of son who called when he needed something. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true and because I spent a long time trying to convince myself it wasn't, and the trying wore me out. He was a pleasant enough person in small doses, and he had moments of genuine warmth, particularly with the children, but there was something in him that had never quite learned to give without expecting something back. Jean used to say that Wayne was a man who kept score, and Jean, who almost never said anything harsh about anyone, was usually right about people. Pamela, his wife of 16 years, was harder to read. She was the kind of woman who smiled constantly in a way that never quite reached her eyes, and who called me by my first name in a tone that made it feel vaguely like a test. I had tried for years to build a real relationship with her and had settled, eventually, for a polite détente at holidays. They lived in Charlotte, about 2 hours from Asheville. Wayne worked in commercial real estate. Pamela ran an interior design consultancy out of their house. On paper, they were doing fine. Which is why I was surprised when Wayne called me on a Tuesday afternoon in January, his voice tight in a way I recognized from his childhood as the sound he made when he was genuinely scared. "Mom," he said. "I need to talk to you about something serious." He told me that a development deal he had been part of had collapsed in litigation. That the legal fees had wiped out their liquid savings. That they were behind on the mortgage, behind on 2 car payments, and that Pamela's design business had dried up almost entirely when 2 of her 3 main clients canceled in the same month. I listened carefully. I asked questions. I asked whether they had spoken to a financial advisor, whether there was family on Pamela's side who could help, whether they had looked into refinancing or a payment plan with the bank. "Mom," he said quietly, "we might lose the house." My grandchildren lived in that house. Lily, who was 14 and already more articulate and perceptive than most adults I knew. Cooper, who was 10 and who had Jean's patient eyes and who had cried at Jean's funeral in a way that told me he understood, even at 6 years old, exactly what loss meant. The thought of those children losing their home, their bedrooms, their stability, landed on me the way Wayne knew it would. "What do you need?" I asked. He didn't ask for money. That surprised me. Instead, he said something I didn't expect. "Mom, I was thinking. Your house. It's worth a lot more than you probably realize. And it's just you there. What if we came up and managed things for a while? Just until we get back on our feet. You'd have help around the house, the kids would get to spend more time with you, and maybe we could figure out a longer-term arrangement." I was careful. I want to be clear about that. I had been married to a man who read contracts for a living, and some of that caution had rubbed off on me over 4 decades. I told Wayne that I would think about it, and the next morning I called Robert Fitch, who had been my estate attorney since Jean and I had drawn up our first wills in 1991. Robert listened to what I told him and said what I expected him to say, which was that I should not put Wayne's name on the deed, should not change my will under any financial pressure, and should not sign any document I hadn't read carefully and had him review first. "Your house is your security, Dorothy," he said. "It's the core of everything. Don't let sentiment override caution." I told him I understood. And I did understand. What I agreed to, in the end, was limited and I believed it was safe. Wayne and Pamela would move into the house with the children temporarily, helping with maintenance and costs in exchange for not paying rent, while they worked to stabilize their finances. I made it clear that nothing about the ownership of the house was changing, that my name remained the only one on the deed, and that any longer-term arrangements would be discussed through attorneys only. I did make one concession that I have thought about every day since. Because Wayne argued that he needed to be able to manage practical household affairs in the event of a medical emergency, I signed a limited healthcare power of attorney designating him to make medical decisions if I became incapacitated. Robert drew it up specifically to exclude any financial authority whatsoever. The document was explicit. Wayne Callahan was authorized to make healthcare decisions for his mother and nothing else. I signed it in Robert's office with 2 witnesses present on a Wednesday afternoon in February. Wayne signed his acknowledgement copy the following week. What I did not know, what I would not discover for many months, was that Wayne had been preparing a second document entirely. Not officially. Not through any process Robert was aware of. He had waited until I stepped out to use the restroom during a break in the signing session, and he had made careful note of every detail of the document in front of him. He had then gone to a different attorney in Charlotte, one he had found through channels that had nothing to do with our family's legal history, and had a separate financial power of attorney prepared using the template language from the healthcare document. A document that granted him broad financial authority, including the authority to manage, list, and sell real property on my behalf. He forged my signature on it the week after our signing appointment, using the copy of my genuine signature from the healthcare POA as his guide. He practiced. The document examiner who would later review his work found 3 prior attempts in the files recovered from his laptop. He had not been careless. He had been methodical. The forged page was good enough to fool a quick glance. It was not good enough to fool a forensic document examiner. But that examination was still months away. First, there was the morning in April when I walked out to my garden to check on the tomato seedlings I had started in March, felt a pressure in my chest unlike anything I had ever felt before, and sat down slowly in the grass between the raised beds and did not get up. The paramedics told me later that my neighbor Marvella had seen me through the fence and called 911 within minutes of my collapse. That those minutes mattered enormously. That if she had looked out 20 minutes later, or if I had fallen on the other side of the house where she couldn't have seen me, the outcome would likely have been different. I don't have clear memories of the first 2 weeks. What I have are fragments, impressions. The sound of equipment. The particular quality of light through hospital blinds. A nurse's voice, steady and kind, telling me I was safe. The feeling of being very heavy and very far away from everything I had known as ordinary life. I had suffered a significant ischemic stroke followed by a cardiac event during stabilization. The stroke affected my left side and my speech temporarily. For the first week, I could not reliably form words. For the second week, I could speak in short sentences but tired rapidly. My cognition, my doctors would later confirm, was entirely intact. My memory was intact. My understanding of what was happening around me was largely intact. But I was weak in a way I had never been in my 72 years, and I was frightened, and when Wayne appeared at my bedside at the end of the first week with Pamela beside him wearing an expression of practiced concern, I was, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, genuinely glad to see him. "We're here, Mom," he said, taking my hand. "We're taking care of everything." I believed him. I squeezed his hand and closed my eyes and let myself be taken care of. That was my second mistake. The thing about a serious medical crisis is that it creates a kind of tunnel around you. Your world narrows to the width of a hospital bed. You are exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You are dependent on other people for things you have done independently for your entire adult life, and that dependency creates a strange, uncomfortable gratitude that makes it difficult to question the people providing for you. Wayne managed my visitors. I learned this later. He told the nursing staff that I was easily overstimulated and needed to rest, and he asked that visitors be limited to family only. This was not an unreasonable request for the first 2 weeks when I was genuinely fragile. What was less reasonable was that it continued into the 3rd and 4th weeks, and that it followed me to Laurel Ridge Rehabilitation Center when I was transferred there in late April. Marvella tried to visit me at the hospital. She was turned away twice by Wayne, who told her I was sleeping and that he would pass along her well wishes. She left flowers at the desk. I never received them. My friend Barbara Osgood from book club tried to call my cell phone, which Wayne had held for safekeeping. She left 4 voicemails over 3 weeks. I never heard them. Robert Fitch's office called twice to check on me, having seen no news from me in an unusual stretch of silence. Wayne told his assistant that I was recovering well and would be in touch when I was ready. Robert, who did not want to intrude on what seemed like a family handling a medical crisis appropriately, did not push further. At Laurel Ridge, I had a phone by my bed. I used it once in the first week to call Wayne and ask about the house and the garden and whether the tomatoes had been watered. He told me everything was fine and that I shouldn't worry about anything, just focus on my therapy. Then he told the nursing staff that I had been showing signs of confusion and anxiety and asked them to monitor my calls and limit outside contact for my well-being. The nursing staff, following what seemed like a reasonable family request about a stroke patient in early recovery, were not eager to facilitate unsanctioned phone calls that they had been told might cause agitation. I want to be careful here not to suggest I was a prisoner or that I was being held against my will in any formal sense. I was a recovering patient in a rehabilitation facility with limited mobility and disrupted speech. I trusted that my son was managing things appropriately at home. I asked him questions when he visited and he gave me answers that sounded plausible. I was tired and focused on the painful, slow work of physical therapy, and I did not have the reserves to push very hard on anything. But I noticed things. I noticed that Wayne changed the subject whenever I asked specific questions about finances or the house. I noticed that Pamela, who visited less frequently than Wayne, had an air of suppressed excitement that seemed out of place in a rehabilitation center. I noticed that when I mentioned calling Robert Fitch, Wayne said there was no need to bother my attorney with anything right now, and that he would handle whatever needed handling. I noticed those things and filed them away in a part of my mind that was slowly, day by day, getting sharper. Marvella Green is one of the most stubborn people I have ever met in my life, and I say that with complete and unconditional affection. She grew up in Chattanooga, the youngest of 6 children, and she has never once in her life accepted being told no as a final answer. She had been turned away from the hospital twice. She had called Wayne's cell phone and been told I was resting. She had gone to the house twice and found Wayne or Pamela home but somehow unavailable to bring her inside. She had left notes and flowers and a coffee cake at the door that she knew, from long experience, was one of my particular favorites. What she did not do was stop trying. And what she noticed, walking past the house on a morning in late June when she was returning from her walking group, was a real estate sign staked neatly into the front lawn of the house on Maple Hill Road. She stopped walking. She stared at the sign. She took out her phone and photographed it from 3 angles. Then she called the listing agent's number on the sign and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the property at that address was available for viewing. Absolutely, the agent told her. We just accepted an offer last week, but if it falls through we'd love to hear from you. Marvella thanked him politely, hung up the phone, and stood on the sidewalk in front of my house for a long time. Then she started making calls of her own. She could not reach me directly. But Marvella was a woman who believed in preparation, and she had, in the 11 years we had been neighbors, memorized the name of my attorney because I had mentioned Robert Fitch enough times that the name had lodged in her memory. She called Fitch and Grover on a Monday morning, asked for Robert Fitch personally, told the receptionist it concerned Dorothy Callahan and was urgent, and waited. Robert called her back within the hour. The conversation that followed lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Robert had pulled up the Buncombe County Register of Deeds online and discovered that a listing had been placed on my property in May. He had also discovered that a power of attorney document had been recorded with the county in April, signed in my name, granting Wayne Callahan broad authority over my real property. A document Robert had never prepared, never seen, and had never authorized. Robert is a careful man and a methodical one, and what he did next was not call Wayne and confront him directly. What he did was call his colleague Susan Okafor, who specialized in elder law, and ask for an urgent consultation. And then he called Laurel Ridge Rehabilitation Center and asked to speak with Dorothy Callahan directly. He was told that Mrs. Callahan's calls were being managed by her family at the family's request. Robert told the person on the phone that he was Mrs. Callahan's attorney of record, that no family member had the authority to restrict her access to legal counsel, and that if Mrs. Callahan was not on the phone within 10 minutes he would be filing an emergency motion with the court. I was in my room doing hand exercises when the phone rang. I remember being surprised that it rang at all at that hour. I remember picking it up and hearing Robert's voice and feeling something shift in my chest that was not cardiac in nature. "Dorothy," he said. "Don't say anything you don't want overheard. Just listen." And I listened. What Robert told me in that phone call I cannot reproduce entirely because some of it became part of a legal proceeding, but I can tell you that by the time he finished speaking I was sitting upright in my bed with my feet on the floor and my hands folded in my lap, and my mind was the clearest it had been since April. They had listed my house. My house, where Jean and I had raised Wayne, where the hemlocks Jean planted now stood 30 feet tall, where the oak doorframe still held the initials my grandchildren had carved when they were small enough to think I hadn't seen them. They had listed it, accepted an offer, and the closing was scheduled for a Thursday, 8 days away. I asked Robert one question. "Can we stop it?" "Yes," he said. "If we move immediately and if the POA document is what I think it is, yes." "Then move," I said. I hung up the phone and sat in the stillness of my rehabilitation room and let myself feel what I was feeling for exactly 60 seconds. Betrayal so complete it has a physical quality to it, like a drop in air pressure. Grief for what I was understanding my son to be. Fear about what came next. And underneath all of that, something harder and steadier, something that had been building since the first time I noticed Wayne change the subject when I mentioned calling my attorney. 60 seconds. Then I picked the phone back up and started making calls. Robert Fitch had 33 years of estate and property law behind him, and he was angry in the particular restrained way that careful men become angry when they discover that something they built with precision has been deliberately dismantled. He filed for an emergency court order to halt the property sale within 24 hours of speaking with me. He also referred the matter to Susan Okafor, whose practice focused entirely on elder financial abuse, and to a forensic document examiner named Patricia Webb who specialized in questioned documents. Patricia Webb examined the power of attorney document that had been recorded with the county and produced her findings within 4 days. The signature page, she determined, was not original to the document. The paper stock was subtly different from the preceding pages. The staple holes didn't align. And the signature itself, while a reasonable attempt at approximating my handwriting, was not mine. It was a forgery. More specifically, it appeared to be modeled on the signature I had genuinely provided on the healthcare POA in Robert's office. Someone had used that document as a reference template to reproduce my signature on a different instrument entirely, one granting broad financial authority that the original document had explicitly excluded. Patricia's preliminary findings were unambiguous and, she noted, thorough enough to present to a grand jury. She gave those findings to Robert on a Friday afternoon. Robert brought them to Susan Okafor. Susan Okafor, who had been conducting her own parallel investigation, had additional information. She had traced the listing agent. His name was Dale Pruitt, a Charlotte-based realtor with 16 years in residential sales who had, curiously, no track record whatsoever in the Asheville market until this listing. He and Wayne had played golf together for 3 years according to their shared social media history. The listing had been priced, in Susan's assessment, roughly 12% below current market value for the neighborhood, quick sale pricing, not maximum value pricing. Someone had been in a hurry. She had also spoken with the buyers, the Hendersons, who were a young couple from Durham who had found the listing through an online platform and had no relationship with Wayne whatsoever. They were an innocent party. They had signed in good faith on a house they believed was legitimately for sale. What Susan had further discovered was that the earnest money deposit, $42,000 from the Hendersons, had been deposited into an account belonging to a property management LLC registered in Wayne's name, a company created just 4 months earlier. The earnest money that should have been held in a neutral escrow account was already sitting in Wayne's business account. That was not a civil matter. That was a crime. Robert called me with the full picture on a Sunday evening, and I sat in my rehabilitation room with my notepad, writing down everything he told me. My hand was steadier than it had been in weeks. Physical therapy does that, I suppose. Builds things back slowly. Restores what was lost. Dorothy, Robert said at the end, I need to ask you something directly. The court order is in place. The closing cannot proceed without being halted. But what do you want to do beyond stopping the sale? There are criminal implications here. Wayne could face serious charges. I looked at what I had written on my notepad. The forged signature. The stolen earnest money. The 8 weeks I had spent in a hospital and then a rehabilitation center being kept from my attorney, my neighbors, my friends. The garden that had gone unwatered. I want to be there when it stopped, I said. In person. I want to look him in the eye. Dorothy, you're still in rehabilitation. I know where I am, Robert. I'm asking if the timing works. There was a pause. The closing is Thursday at 2 p.m. Then I need to check out Wednesday. My physiatrist was a serious young woman named Dr. Anita Varma who had, over the previous 6 weeks, developed what I suspected was a cautious respect for her most demanding patient. I told her on Monday morning what I intended to do and why, and she looked at me for a long time without speaking. Mrs. Callahan, she said finally, you have made extraordinary progress. Your mobility is good, your speech has fully returned, and your cognitive function has been intact throughout. But you are still in early recovery from a significant neurological event. The physical and emotional stress of a confrontation. Dr. Varma, I said, the alternative is allowing my son to complete the sale of my home while I sit in this building. With respect, I believe that would be significantly more damaging to my health than attending a closing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you'll need to use the cane. You'll need someone with you at all times. And I want to see you back here the following Monday for a full evaluation. Agreed. And Mrs. Callahan? If you feel any chest discomfort or dizziness, you stop immediately and call emergency services. You do not push through it. Understood. She signed my discharge paperwork that afternoon. Marvella arrived to pick me up Wednesday morning in a car she had cleaned and stocked with a thermos of coffee and a container of the oatmeal cookies she knew I liked. She had also, in the 2 weeks since she'd discovered what was happening, done several things I had not asked her to do but found myself deeply grateful for. She had photographed the property every day since spotting the sign, documenting the listing sign, the lockbox, the realtor's cards left in the door, the day the photographer came to shoot interiors, and 2 showings she had watched from her kitchen window. She had, without any legal training whatsoever, produced a photographic timeline that Robert described as more organized than half the evidence he received from actual investigators. She had also called Barbara Osgood, who had called the rest of the book club, who had each separately tried to contact me at Laurel Ridge and been turned away, a pattern Robert was now documenting as deliberate isolation. And she had, on her own initiative, spoken with the neighbors on both sides of my property, who confirmed they had never been informed of any sale and had in fact been told by Pamela, when they asked about the sign, that it was a mistake being sorted out. Robert was waiting at his office when Marvella brought me in Wednesday afternoon. Susan Okafor was there. And so was Detective Frank Delgado from the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office Economic Crimes Unit, to whom Robert and Susan had already presented a preliminary case summary. Detective Delgado was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s who had the manner of someone who had heard a very large number of terrible things and had learned to keep his reactions carefully calibrated. He shook my hand, told me he was sorry for what I had been through, and got straight to the matter. Mrs. Callahan, what your son has done constitutes multiple serious crimes under North Carolina law. Forgery of a legal instrument. Recording a false instrument. Misappropriation of escrow funds. Potentially elder financial abuse and exploitation. We can build a strong case. What I need from you is your cooperation and your patience while we gather the last pieces before making arrests. When are you planning to make arrests? I asked. We'd prefer to coordinate with the closing tomorrow if possible. More controlled circumstances, and it creates an unambiguous record of the fraud attempt in real time. So you want me there? We'd like you there. But Mrs. Callahan, I want to be honest with you. Your being there is not legally necessary. We have enough to arrest him without the dramatic element. If you'd prefer. I'll be there, I said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then here's what's going to happen, Detective Delgado said. Piedmont Title and Escrow Services occupied the second floor of a brick building on Marymount Avenue that I had driven past several hundred times in the decades I had lived in Asheville without ever having occasion to enter. The lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and recirculated air. The closing rooms were off a central hallway, each with a rectangular table and padded chairs and the particular silence of spaces where large financial transactions are routinely completed. We arrived at 1:45. Robert and I and Marvella and Detective Delgado and a second deputy named Crane. Robert had called the escrow officer, a woman named Jan Holloway who had been in the business for 22 years, the previous afternoon and told her what was coming, and she had, to her considerable credit, responded with complete professionalism. She had not called Wayne or Pamela or Dale Pruitt. She had spoken with her company's legal counsel, confirmed that a valid court injunction existed, and prepared for what she later described as the most unusual closing of her career. I walked into that building on my cane and I want to tell you honestly how I felt. I want to tell you I felt powerful and righteous and unafraid. The truth is more complicated. My left hand trembled slightly, which it still did sometimes, a remnant of the stroke. My heart was beating faster than Dr. Varma would have approved of. I was wearing the Goodwill coat I had bought the winter before Jean died, and I had put on lipstick in the car because my mother always told me that lipstick was armor, and in that moment I believed her completely. What I felt, underneath the fear and the trembling and the too fast heartbeat, was a kind of cold clarity. The same clarity I remembered from the mornings before difficult parent conferences, when a child was being failed by someone and it was my job to stand in the gap. I had been a teacher for 31 years. I knew how to walk into a room with authority even when I was frightened. We entered the closing room at 1:50. Wayne and Pamela were already seated on the far side of the table, papers arranged in front of them, Wayne in a blazer I had given him for his 45th birthday. Dale Pruitt sat beside them, a broad-shouldered man in a sport coat who was deep in quiet conversation with Wayne when we opened the door. The Henderson couple sat on the near side of the table looking pleasant and slightly uncertain about the general atmosphere. The moment Wayne looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, the color left his face with a completeness I had not seen since he was 11 years old and I had found the broken lamp he had hidden in the back of his closet. Pamela's reaction was different. Her expression went entirely still in a way that told me her mind was moving very fast. Dale Pruitt, who didn't know me by sight, looked briefly curious and then looked at Wayne, and what he saw in Wayne's face made him push his chair back from the table slightly, an unconscious preparation for movement. I walked to the head of the table. Robert placed a folder in front of Jan Holloway. Detective Delgado and Deputy Crane remained near the door. Mrs. Callahan, Jan said, her voice entirely steady. We have received and reviewed the court order. This closing cannot proceed. What is happening? Wayne stood up, and his voice had the particular pitch of a man who is prepared for several scenarios but not, quite, this one. Mom, what are you? How are you? You're supposed to be. Sit down, Wayne, I said. The Hendersons looked at each other. The young woman reached for her husband's hand. There seems to be some kind of misunderstanding, Wayne said, not sitting. Mom, you were sick, you're still recovering, you don't fully understand what. Robert, I said. Robert set 3 documents on the table in front of Wayne. He spoke in the measured tone of a man with 33 years of practice behind him. Mr. Callahan, the power of attorney document recorded with the county on April 18 of this year has been examined by a certified forensic document examiner and found to contain a forged signature page. A court order has been issued halting this transaction. Additionally, law enforcement has been notified regarding the misappropriation of escrow funds held in your LLC account. That's insane, Wayne said. His voice was too loud now. That POA is legitimate. She signed it. She's confused, she's been sick, she doesn't. Wayne. I said his name quietly and he stopped. I looked at him across the table. This man I had carried and nursed and sat up with during fevers and attended every school play of and bailed out of more difficulties than I should have, and I said, I know exactly what you did. I know when you did it. And I know why. The room was very quiet. Pamela put her hand on Wayne's arm. It was not a comforting gesture. It was the gesture of someone trying to prevent a larger mistake. It didn't work. You were in the hospital, Wayne said, and his voice had changed, gone lower and angrier, and I recognized the shift. It was the voice he used when he was cornered. You were lying in a hospital bed for weeks. The house was just sitting there. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain a property like that? I was managing things. I had legal authority. You had forged authority, Robert said. Mom. Wayne turned to me and his voice softened in the way it did when he was reaching for the part of me that was, before everything else, his mother. Mom, I was going to take care of you. With the proceeds from the sale, we could have set you up somewhere beautiful. You wouldn't have had to worry about anything ever again. I don't need someone to take care of me, Wayne, I said. I need people around me who are honest. Detective Delgado stepped forward. What happened at the table next was swift and procedural in the way that legal and law enforcement actions are, which is to say it bore almost no resemblance to how such scenes play out in television dramas. Wayne did not confess dramatically. He did not break down. He called his attorney on his cell phone, was advised to say nothing, and said nothing. Pamela did the same. Dale Pruitt, who was visibly sweating through his sport coat, produced his own attorney's number almost immediately and likewise said nothing. Detective Delgado informed them that they would be required to appear at the sheriff's department for formal questioning. He did not arrest them on the spot, which he explained to me afterward was deliberate. Better to let them think they have room to maneuver, he said. People make more mistakes when they believe they're still getting away with something. Jan Holloway returned the earnest money deposit to the Hendersons, who were gracious and visibly upset in equal measure. I spoke with them briefly in the hallway afterward and apologized for their experience, none of which was their fault. They were expecting their first child and had believed they were buying a home to raise a family in. I felt genuinely sorry for what they had been put through. I gave them Robert's card and told them that if they were still looking in the Asheville area, my attorney could refer them to someone honest. Marvella drove me home. We pulled into the driveway and I sat in the car for a full minute looking at the front porch, the listing sign now removed per the injunction, the familiar angle of the roofline against the October sky. The tomatoes in the garden had died, unwatered through the long summer. The hemlocks were fine. Do you want to go inside? Marvella asked. Yes, I said. She walked me in and put the kettle on and sat across from me at the kitchen table while I looked around the room where Gene had read his newspaper every morning for 40 years, and I let myself cry. Not from grief, exactly. From relief so complete it feels like grief's cousin. Those absolute bastards, Marvella said, with the succinct accuracy that I have always appreciated about her. I laughed, which surprised me. Then I kept crying a little. Then I drank my tea. 2 days later, Wayne called me. I had expected the call and had prepared for it. Robert had advised me to record it, and North Carolina being a one-party consent state, I did. Wayne's tone was not what I expected. He didn't lead with anger. He led with injury. He told me that I had humiliated him in front of clients and colleagues and that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding that could have been handled privately. He told me that he had only ever been trying to help me, that a woman my age living alone in a house that size was not practical or safe, and that his mistake had been in not communicating his plans more clearly rather than in the plans themselves. "You forged my signature," I said. "Mom, that is a very serious accusation. It's what Patricia Webb's examination found." "I'm not making an accusation. I'm stating a conclusion reached by a certified forensic examiner." A pause. Then the tone shifted, this time to something colder. "You're going to destroy this family over a house. You know that." "I didn't start this, Wayne. The kids are going to know that their grandmother took their father to court. They're going to know you sided with lawyers over family. Lily and Cooper will know exactly what happened and who was responsible for it. I intend to be honest with them. You don't get to decide what they know. They're my children. They are. And they are my grandchildren. And they will eventually be old enough to understand the truth, whatever you tell them between now and then." The silence on the other end lasted a long time. When Wayne spoke again, his voice was low and deliberate in a way that reminded me of no one I wanted to be reminded of. "You want to make this a war, Mom? We can make it a war." I thought about what he had said. I thought about everything I had learned over the past 8 weeks. And then I thought about something I had told my English classes many times over 31 years, that the most important question you can ask about any text is not what it says on the surface but what it reveals about the person saying it. Wayne had just told me, clearly and without intending to, exactly who he was. "Goodbye, Wayne," I said. And I ended the call. Robert had retained a private investigator named Karen Ashby 3 days after my phone call from the rehabilitation center. Karen was a 49-year-old former bank fraud investigator who had gone private 8 years earlier and who, according to Robert, was methodical to the point of being intimidating. She called me the week after the closing confrontation and asked if she could come to the house. She came on a Tuesday morning and sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and 3 folders and a large coffee and walked me through what she had found with the calm efficiency of someone presenting a quarterly report. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "the picture here is more extensive than the immediate fraud. I want to start with the POA forgery, because I think understanding how it was done tells you something important about who you're dealing with." The forgery had required preparation. Wayne had not improvised it. He had researched the process of recording a power of attorney in Buncombe County, obtained a template document from a legal document service in Charlotte, and made at least 3 prior attempts before producing the version ultimately recorded, based on drafts Karen had found in deleted files from his email account obtained through a subpoena. "He planned this," I said. "Not a question." "Months before you had any medical event," Karen confirmed. "The email drafts I was able to access start in December. He was researching your property value, the recording process, and comparable sales in your neighborhood. He was building toward this before he ever called you about his financial troubles." The financial troubles themselves, Karen had found, were real but dramatically overstated. Wayne had made a poor investment in a development project that had indeed collapsed in litigation, and he had credit card debt that was genuinely substantial. But the project loss was significantly smaller than what he had represented to me, and his income had remained stable throughout. He had not been facing foreclosure. He had been facing the kind of financial stress that requires budgeting and restraint rather than emergency intervention. "He told you what you needed to hear to get access to the property," Karen said simply. "And Dale Pruitt?" Karen's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Pruitt has worked with Wayne on several transactions over the years, mostly in Charlotte. He knew this listing was unusual. He accepted a commission structure substantially below market rate, which suggests he was compensated another way. We believe he received a separate direct payment from Wayne, which would constitute undisclosed compensation, a violation of his real estate license and potentially wire fraud." She opened the second folder. "There's something else you need to know, Mrs. Callahan. 2 years ago, Wayne and Pamela approached your late husband's sister, your sister-in-law, Margaret Callahan in Hendersonville, with a request for a loan. $40,000, to help with what they described as a tax liability. Margaret, who was 81 at the time and had recently lost her husband, gave them the money. She never received any repayment or any documentation. She didn't tell anyone because she was embarrassed, and because Wayne had told her you were aware of the situation and had approved it. I set down my teacup. She passed away in February, Karen said quietly. Natural causes. But Mrs. Callahan, what this means is that what happened to you was not an improvised act of desperation. It was a pattern. The third folder contained something I had been half expecting and half dreading. Social media records from an account Pamela maintained under a name I didn't recognize, which Karen had traced to her through email metadata. The account had been active for about 18 months. The posts were photographs of my house, with captions describing it as our new project and finally getting what we deserve and, in one post from 3 weeks before the scheduled closing, a photograph of the kitchen Jean and I had last updated in 2009, captioned, "This whole place needs gutting. Can't wait to start over. New chapter." She had been planning to gut Jean's kitchen. I sat with that for a moment. "Mrs. Callahan," Karen said, "are you all right?" "I'm processing," I said. I looked at the photograph of my kitchen, the kitchen where Jean had made his Sunday morning eggs and where Lily had learned to bake bread and where I had stood at the counter for 40 years watching the garden through the window above the sink. "What else do I need to do?" I asked. Detective Delgado called me the following Friday with an update. The case had been referred to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division in addition to the county's Economic Crimes Unit, given that the forgery and escrow fraud crossed thresholds that triggered state-level jurisdiction. The misappropriated earnest money, combined with evidence of Wayne's communications with Pruitt, met the threshold for wire fraud, which had the potential to bring federal involvement as well. "Mrs. Callahan, I'd like to ask whether you'd be willing to speak on the record about the isolation tactics at the rehabilitation center, because that may be relevant to an elder abuse charge." I told him I would speak on the record about everything. What I had been thinking about most, though, was not the legal mechanics. What I had been thinking about was Lily and Cooper. Since the closing confrontation, I had received no communication from my grandchildren. Wayne had made it clear, through his attorney's communications with Robert, that he was considering filing for a restraining order on the grounds that I had subjected his children to undue stress by involving law enforcement in a family financial matter. This was a thin legal argument and Robert dismissed it as posturing, but the practical effect was that Wayne controlled whether I spoke to Lily and Cooper, and he was using that control. What I did not know, at that point, was that Lily had her own phone, paid for with her own babysitting money, on an account Wayne didn't have access to. And that Lily, who was 14 and had always been more perceptive than people gave her credit for, had been forming her own conclusions about events for quite some time. She called me on a Sunday evening from her bedroom, keeping her voice low. "Grandma, she said, I need to talk to you." I sat up straighter. "I'm here, sweetheart. I know what happened at the closing. Cooper doesn't totally understand it yet, but I do." A pause. "Dad says you tried to take his money and got lawyers involved to embarrass the family." "But Grandma, I heard them talking the night before the closing. I heard Mom say that by Thursday they'd finally be done with the whole thing and they wouldn't have to deal with you anymore." I closed my eyes briefly. "When did you hear that?" "I was supposed to be asleep." Another pause. "Was the house really yours?" "Dad said you'd basically signed it over to him." "Lily, that house is mine. Has always been mine. No one ever discussed giving it to your father." The silence on the other end was long and particular. It was the silence of a 14-year-old recalibrating a great many things at once. "Grandma, are you okay? You were in the hospital so long and they kept saying you were confused, but you don't seem confused." "I had a stroke, Lily. My body was hurt. My mind was fine." "I knew it," she said, and there was a fierceness in her voice that made my throat tighten. "I knew something was wrong. They were being weird about the house and about letting us call you and I kept asking and they kept saying you needed to rest." "You wanted to call me?" Cooper cried about it. He didn't want Dad to see, so he only cried at night, but I heard him. He wanted to talk to you. I had to set the phone down for a moment and press my hand against my mouth. Lily, I said when I trusted my voice again, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with the legal situation, you and Cooper are the most important people in my world. That doesn't change based on what your parents did. Are they going to go to jail? I didn't lie to her. I don't know yet. That depends on a lot of things being worked out by people better equipped than me to work them out. If they go to jail, what happens to us? That is something I am going to make absolutely sure is taken care of properly. You have my word on that. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called Robert and told him that if the criminal proceedings moved toward arrest, I wanted to be prepared to petition for temporary custody arrangements through Pamela's parents, the Sherwoods, who lived in Wilmington and who Karen's investigation had revealed were decent, stable people who had been gradually and deliberately frozen out of their grandchildren's lives over the previous 2 years. The arrests came on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks after the closing confrontation. Wayne and Pamela were charged with forgery of a legal instrument, recording a false instrument, financial exploitation of an elder adult, obstruction through isolation of a vulnerable adult, and misappropriation of escrow funds. Dale Pruitt was arrested at his Charlotte office and charged with conspiracy and unlicensed compensation fraud. Robert called me when it was done. I was in the garden, which I had been slowly restoring since coming home. The tomatoes were a total loss, but I had planted a late crop of kale and Swiss chard, and the hemlocks Jean had tended so patiently stood indifferent and unchanged against the October sky. I thanked Robert and put the phone in my pocket and stood among the raised beds for a while. I had been expecting to feel something more dramatic. Satisfaction, or vindication, or even anger finally released. What I felt was quieter than any of that. Something like the end of a long storm, when the air goes still and smells clean and the damage is visible, but so is the fact that things still stand. Lily called me that evening. She and Cooper had been placed temporarily with the Sherwoods in Wilmington following the arrests. Pamela's mother, a woman named Carol Sherwood whom I had never met in person but had spoken with twice on the phone in the preceding weeks, had proved to be exactly what Karen's investigation suggested, warm, level-headed, and absolutely committed to her grandchildren. Grandma. Lily said, Cooper wants to talk to you. There was a rustling and then Cooper's voice, 10 years old and careful. Hi, Grandma. Hi, sweetheart. How are you doing? Okay. A pause. Grandma. Grandpa Jean's house is still okay, right? They didn't sell it? It's fine, Cooper. The house is exactly where it's always been. I heard him exhale, and I understood from that single sound how much weight a 10-year-old had been carrying without anyone knowing. Good, he said. Because I have my initials in the door there. You do, I said. I never sanded them out. There was a moment I cannot describe adequately. The kind of moment that holds in itself all the things you fought for and why. I know, Cooper said, and I could hear that he was smiling. Wayne accepted a plea agreement 7 months after his arrest. He pled guilty to forgery of a legal instrument and financial exploitation of an elder adult and was sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison with supervised release to follow. The felony convictions also cost him his real estate license permanently. Pamela fought the charges longer, which her attorney advised against and which the judge noted with some asperity at sentencing. She was convicted on all counts and received 6 years. Dale Pruitt, who cooperated early and fully with investigators, received 18 months and surrender of his real estate license. I sat in the courtroom for the sentencing. I want to tell you it was a moment of triumph, but it was not. There is nothing triumphant about watching the father of your grandchildren be led away in a suit that cost more than his character was worth, knowing that Lily and Cooper would carry this in some form for the rest of their lives. What I felt was quieter, the knowledge that I had not been erased. That what they had tried to do had been named, documented, and answered. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named the Honorable Rebecca Moss, addressed Wayne directly. Mr. Callahan, you exploited your mother during the most vulnerable period of her life. You isolated her from her attorney, her neighbors, and her friends. You forged her signature on a legal instrument and you attempted to liquidate her home of 40 years while she lay in a rehabilitation facility recovering from a stroke. What makes this case particularly egregious is not only the financial dimension but the personal one. You were not a stranger who targeted a vulnerable elderly woman. You were her son. The betrayal of that trust constitutes something this court takes with full seriousness. Wayne said nothing when given the opportunity to address the court. Pamela said she was sorry. The judge, who had read the full case file, acknowledged this with the expression of someone who has professionally evaluated the sincerity of apologies for many years and found this one wanting. The house remained mine. The earnest money was returned to the Hendersons with interest, and they eventually found a home on the other side of town that I hope has brought them every happiness they deserved. The court ordered restitution payments to Margaret Callahan's estate in Hendersonville, which her daughter received with the particular quiet gratitude of someone who had long since stopped expecting justice and was surprised to find it. When it was all finished and the courtroom had emptied and Robert and I walked out together into a November afternoon with the particular pale light of late autumn in the mountains, he looked at me and said, "Dorothy, you know this doesn't happen if you don't push." "Marvella pushed," I said. "Marvella found the sign. You made every decision after that." I thought about the phone call from my rehabilitation room. The 60 seconds I had allowed myself to feel everything before picking the phone back up. The Wednesday morning I had checked out against medical advice in my Goodwill coat. Jean always said I was stubborn, I told Robert. Jean, Robert said, was correct. Carol and Dennis Sherwood were people I should have met 15 years earlier, and the fact that I hadn't was one of the minor casualties of a son who had found it useful to keep his family relationships compartmentalized. They drove up from Wilmington to visit me at Maple Hill 3 weeks after the sentencing, and we sat on the front porch with coffee and the sharp wind coming off the mountains and talked for 4 hours. They were people who had loved their daughter and spent years watching her become someone they didn't recognize, and their grief about it was genuine and deep. Dennis Sherwood, who was 74 and had worked his career as a high school principal, told me that they had tried to intervene twice when they suspected Wayne was having a negative influence on Pamela's character, and both times had been methodically shut out of the family circle. "She wasn't a bad person," Carol said quietly. "I don't think she started that way. I think she learned a set of values from Wayne that hollowed out the things she used to be." "I understand that," I said. "The children need both sets of grandparents," Carol said. "That's what I believe. They need people who knew who Pamela was before." "I agree completely," I said. Lily and Cooper came to stay at Maple Hill for 2 weeks in December while the Sherwoods settled longer-term arrangements. Lily arrived with a sketchbook she had been filling for 2 years and sat at my kitchen table for an entire afternoon showing me every page. Cooper arrived with a soccer ball and spent an hour in the backyard before he came inside, stopping at the back door to look at the initials in the oak doorframe. "Hi," he said to the doorframe, softly, in the way a person greets something they have missed. I pretended not to notice so that he wouldn't be embarrassed. But I noticed. On their 3rd morning, Lily came downstairs early and found me in the kitchen before I had started the coffee, sitting at the table with Jean's old photograph album open to a page from 1987, Wayne at 12, squinting in the summer sun at a fishing hole in the Smokies. "Grandma. Lily said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask me anything," I said. "Do you hate Dad?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," I said. "I don't think I do. I'm not sure I have enough energy left for hate. What I feel is more like grief, I suppose. For the person I thought he was. And very clear eyes about the person he turned out to be." Lily sat down across from me. She had Jean's coloring, dark eyes and dark hair, and something in her expression that reminded me of how Jean had looked when he was working through a hard problem, a quality of settling in. "I feel like I should hate him," she said, "and then I feel guilty for not hating him, and then I feel guilty for hating him, and it just keeps going around." "That's grief too," I said. "It doesn't move in a straight line. Do you think he'll be different when he gets out? I thought carefully before answering. I genuinely don't know, Lily. What I know is that who he is in prison or after prison is not something you can control or predict. What you can control is what kind of person you decide to be. She looked at me for a moment. Like you. I'm still figuring out what kind of person I am, I said honestly. At 72. Some things take a while. She smiled at that. A real smile, not the careful watchful one I had been seeing since October. She reached across the table and turned the page of Jean's photograph album. Tell me about this one, she said. And I did. Marvella had a catering kitchen built off the back of her house this summer after all of this happened, which she had been considering for years and finally committed to when I told her, a year too late, that she cooked better than anyone I had ever sat down with and that the city of Asheville was poorer for not having access to her biscuits on a professional basis. She started hosting weekend brunches, limited to 12 people, that became within 3 months impossible to book without a 2-week wait. I helped her design the menu the first time and she rolled her eyes at 2 of my suggestions and adopted the third, which became the most popular item. I returned to my garden with a methodical stubbornness that Dr. Varma, when I reported it at my follow-up appointments, described as excellent physical therapy whether I intended it that way or not. The late kale came in beautifully. I planted new tomatoes the following spring and this time they grew. The book club reconvened at my house the second Tuesday after I came home from Laurel Ridge, which was Barbara Osgood's idea and exactly what I needed, which is often how Barbara's ideas work. We read a novel about a woman rebuilding after loss and the conversation went 3 hours longer than usual and ended with everybody in tears over the last chapter and someone finishing the second bottle of wine. It was one of the best evenings I can remember in recent years. Robert Fitch retired 8 months after the trial and handed my account to his partner, a sharp young attorney named Grace Ewan, whom I liked immediately and who has the additional quality of being about 40 years younger than me, which means she will still be practicing law when I genuinely need an estate attorney in the way I hope not to need one for quite some time yet. The Sherwoods and I developed a rhythm. They kept Lily and Cooper in Wilmington during the school year, which was the more stable arrangement, and the children came to Maple Hill for summers and winter breaks and a rotating series of holidays that we negotiated with the cheerful pragmatism of people who understand that what matters is the time itself, not which calendar day it falls on. Carol and I spoke on the phone every Sunday, first for practical coordination and gradually because we had discovered we had a great deal to talk about. Cooper, who was growing fast and had developed a seriousness of purpose that the Sherwoods said reminded them of Dennis at the same age, asked me to teach him chess the first summer he came back to Asheville. We spent 2 weeks on it, evenings after dinner on the front porch, the board between us and the mountains visible at the far end of the road where it curved and opened up. He beat me for the first time in his 3rd summer. He was not subtle about being pleased with himself, which is entirely as it should be. Lily was admitted to the Asheville School of the Arts at 16, a competitive program that required both an academic application and a portfolio review. She drove up from Wilmington with Carol on a Saturday in April to show me her acceptance letter in person. We stood on the front porch and I held the letter and read it twice and then hugged her for a long time. Grandma. She said into my shoulder, I listed you as a person who influenced my artistic development in my personal statement. Did you? I said. I said you were the person who taught me that what matters isn't what someone tries to take from you. It's what you decide to keep. I held on to her a moment longer. That, I told her, is better than anything I have ever said. She laughed, and the laugh sounded like itself, easy and unguarded. The laugh of a young woman with real distance between herself and the hardest things she had learned. I am 75 years old as I finish telling you this story. I sit in my kitchen at the table where Jean read his newspaper for 40 years, with the window above the sink showing me the garden in mid-morning light, and I think about what I understand now that I didn't quite know before all of this happened. I knew, in the abstract, that love is not the same as loyalty. I had taught books about that distinction for 3 decades. But knowing something as a concept and knowing it through the specific weight of your own experience are different forms of knowledge, and I cannot honestly pretend they are equivalent. What Wayne did was a calculated decision made by a man who had a mother who loved him and who chose to see that love as a resource to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored. There is nothing I could have done differently to change that. It was not my failure. It was his choice. I have thought about going to visit him. The thought comes and goes. I have spoken with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Holt, who has helped me understand the difference between forgiveness as a gift you give yourself and reconciliation as a relationship you rebuild with another person. The first, she told me, does not require the second. I have forgiven Wayne in the sense that I no longer carry his actions around inside me as an ongoing source of pain. I have not forgiven him in the sense of returning to a relationship with him, because the relationship as it existed was predicated on something that was never true. I do not know who Wayne will be after prison. I no longer feel an obligation to wait and find out. Marvella will disagree with exactly none of this analysis and will likely add something pointed that I'll be thinking about for the next 2 days. She is right, most of the time. The house stands. The hemlocks Jean planted stand. The initials in the oak doorframe stand, small and deliberate, exactly where they have always been. The garden grows in the particular way of things that survive disruption, not unchanged, but more itself for having come through. There is something I want to say to you directly, whoever you are, before I finish. It is the thing I would have wanted someone to say to me before any of this happened, and the reason I have chosen to tell this story rather than keep it quietly to myself. Your home, your name, your legal documents, the things you have built and saved and signed, they deserve protection that does not depend on the goodwill of the people around you. Not because the people around you are necessarily bad, but because goodwill is a fragile instrument and the law is a more reliable one. My father knew this. He taught me this. I knew it in theory and applied it imperfectly, and the gap between knowing and applying cost me 11 weeks in a rehabilitation center and a summer of unwatered tomatoes and a level of fear I do not wish on anyone. Have an attorney. Know your documents. Know who holds power over your affairs and exactly what that power extends to and what it does not. Tell someone you trust the things they would need to know if you were ever in a hospital bed and couldn't tell them yourself. Marvella did not stop what Wayne tried to do. She did the single most important thing, she saw it happening, and she refused to look away. Know your Marvella. And if the day ever comes when someone tries to take what is yours, when you are standing in a doorway and the person across the room has turned the color of old chalk, I want you to remember that being 72 years old in a good wool coat is not a disadvantage. It is, in fact, a considerable one. You know things about who you are and what you will defend that no one, regardless of what they forge or file or scheme, can ever take from you. They thought they were leaving behind a woman who would quietly accept the loss of everything she had built and grieve alone and go somewhere small and managed where she would cause no further inconvenience. They were thinking of a different woman entirely. The morning after the closing confrontation, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in 11 weeks. The light came through the curtains the same way it always had, touching the same corner of the ceiling it had touched for 40 years. I could hear the hemlocks moving in the early wind outside. I made coffee in my own kitchen. I stood at the window above the sink and looked at my garden, the raised beds and the spent stalks and the October ground waiting for whatever I would plant next. I was home. Everything that came after, the legal proceedings, the sentencing, the long rebuilding of what had been disrupted, all of it was real and important and I am not dismissing any of it. But the thing I carried forward from that morning, the thing I want to give you if I can, is simpler than all of that. I stood at my window in my kitchen in my house on Maple Hill Road and I understood, with a clarity I have not lost since, that I was not someone things happened to. I was someone who decided what happened next. The tomatoes would be planted again in spring. The children would come in summer. Marvella would come over on Tuesday evenings. The book club would gather around a table and argue beautifully about things that mattered. The house would stand. I was just getting started. While I was lying in that hospital bed learning to speak again, Wayne was busy. Karen Ashby's investigation reconstructed his activity during those 11 weeks with a precision that I found, even after everything, stunning in its cold efficiency. He had moved quickly. Within 10 days of my being admitted to Mission Hospital, he had contacted Dale Pruitt in Charlotte and asked for a market analysis of the Maple Hill property. Within 3 weeks, he had filed the forged power of attorney with the Register of Deeds. Within 5 weeks, the house was listed at a price designed to move fast. He had also, Karen discovered, spoken with 2 assisted living facilities in the greater Asheville area. Not to arrange care for me out of genuine concern, but to determine what a monthly rate looked like and whether a lump sum payment could be structured from the proceeds of a property sale. He had called them posing as a concerned son exploring options for a mother who had experienced a significant stroke. Both facilities had sent him literature. Both had his contact information on file. He had been pricing me out before I was even out of the ICU. Karen also found evidence that Pamela had visited the house 3 times during the period I was at Laurel Ridge, each time with a contractor she had apparently found through her design network. Estimates had been requested for kitchen renovation, bathroom updates, and the conversion of the sunroom Jean had built in 1998 into what the contractor's notes described as home office, client preference for modern open plan. The estimates were dated May, when the house was already listed and a buyer had not yet been found. Pamela had been redesigning the inside of my home while I was in a rehabilitation facility 2 miles away. I want to pause on that detail for a moment, because when Karen showed it to me I needed a pause. Not because it was the worst thing in the folder, it wasn't, but because of what it revealed about the texture of the betrayal. Wayne's actions had a calculating coldness to them that was, in its way, comprehensible. He had debt. He had a plan. He executed it without sentiment. That is a species of cruelty I can categorize, even if I cannot forgive. But Pamela scheduling contractors to gut the kitchen where I had cooked 40 years of family meals while I lay down the road learning to form words again, that was something different. That was not expedience. That was appetite. And there is something about appetite, about someone wanting your things with that particular relish, that leaves a mark that takes longer to scrub out. I don't tell you this to dwell in bitterness. I am past that particular dwelling. I tell you because I want you to understand that what happened to me was not the result of a moment of poor judgment or financial panic. It was planned, considered, and in certain details, enjoyed. And knowing that made every decision I made afterward feel not only justified but necessary. The document that Wayne had recorded at the Buncombe County Register of Deeds on April 18 was, on the surface, unremarkable. Power of attorney documents are recorded there regularly. Elderly people appoint family members to act on their behalf for financial matters all the time, and the registrar's office does not routinely authenticate the signatures on those documents. They record what is brought to them. What made this document unusual, and what Robert caught almost immediately when he pulled it, was that its language bore a significant resemblance to a standard form he recognized, a form whose template structure he happened to know well, having used variants of it in his own practice for years. The specific exclusions and carve-outs that should have been present, given how carefully the healthcare POA had been drafted just weeks earlier, were simply absent. In their place was broad, permissive language that would have given Wayne authority to act on my behalf in virtually any financial matter. Robert called Patricia Webb from his car in the county building parking lot. He described what he was seeing. She told him to make no copies and to handle the document as little as possible and to get it to her office by end of day. Patricia Webb had testified in more than 40 forensic document cases in her career, including several criminal proceedings in federal court. When she called Robert 3 days after receiving the document, her voice had the particular quality of a professional whose findings have surprised even them. "Robert," she said, "the substituted page is good. Whoever did this has some facility with document production, the font is correctly matched, the margins are within acceptable range, and the general formatting holds up to casual inspection. But there are 3 points of failure. The paper stock on the substituted page has a slightly different weight and finish from the preceding pages. This is consistent with the substitute being printed on a different batch of the same paper, or a very close substitute, rather than an identical source. The second problem is the staple holes. When a document is bound and then disassembled and reassembled, the holes almost never align perfectly. These don't. And the third problem is the signature itself. What about the signature? Robert asked. It's modeled on a genuine example. Whoever produced it had access to Dorothy's authentic signature and used it as a reference. The letter forms are close. The pressure distribution is approximate. But the rhythm is wrong. Handwriting has a timing to it, a cadence, and when you're copying rather than signing naturally, even the most careful forger introduces micro-hesitations that show up under magnification. This signature has them throughout. It was copied. It was not written. Robert thanked her and called me at Laurel Ridge within the hour. The court order to halt the closing was filed the following morning, with Patricia's preliminary findings attached as supporting documentation. I did not sleep well on the Wednesday night before the closing. Marvella had offered to stay, but I had told her I was fine and that I needed the quiet, both of which were true and neither of which was entirely the whole truth. What I also needed was to sit in my house alone for the first time in 11 weeks and let it be mine again in a way that other people's presence, even kind presence, would have complicated. I made chamomile tea and sat in Jean's armchair in the front room, which is where I always sit when I need to think in the way that requires absolute stillness. The house settled around me the way old houses do at night, the particular language of wood and plaster that you learn over 40 years until it is as familiar as breathing. I thought about Wayne as a boy. I thought about a specific afternoon when he was 9 years old and had fallen from his bicycle at the end of the driveway and had come inside with both palms scraped raw and his lip trembling and had said, with the absolute dignity of a 9-year-old trying very hard not to cry, "It doesn't hurt that much." I had cleaned and bandaged his hands and told him that it was all right to cry, that there was nothing weak about it, and he had looked at me with an expression I had not been able to name then and could name now. He had been calculating whether I was someone who could be told the truth. He had been 9 years old and already keeping score. I thought about that for a long time in Jean's armchair. I also thought about the Hendersons, who would be arriving at Piedmont Title at 2 in the afternoon expecting to sign papers on a home they had been preparing for since summer. They had done nothing wrong. They had found a listing, fallen in love with a house, gone through the financing process, passed inspection, and were hours from what they believed would be one of the most significant days of their lives. That Wayne's fraud had used them as instruments without their knowledge or consent was, in its way, one of the more complete pictures of what he had become, a man for whom other people were simply elements in a transaction. I decided that night that whatever happened after the closing, I wanted to speak with them. Not to apologize for Wayne's choices, which were not mine to apologize for, but to acknowledge that they had been treated as means rather than people, and that this was wrong, and that I was sorry they had been caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with them. I fell asleep in Jean's armchair around midnight and woke up when the hemlocks started moving in the early wind, which is a sound I have been waking up to for 40 years and which, on that particular morning, felt like the best sound I had ever heard. I got up, made coffee, and put on my Goodwill coat. In the months following the sentencing, Susan Okafor called me twice about other cases involving elder financial abuse by family members in western North Carolina. The second time, she asked whether I would be willing to speak with the victim directly, a woman named Estelle Garner, 78, whose son had attempted a deed transfer through a different mechanism but with very similar emotional architecture. The same manufactured crisis. The same manufactured urgency. The same calculated use of a mother's love as a lever. I drove to Estelle's house on a Tuesday afternoon and sat with her for 2 hours in her living room. She was a slight woman with careful hands and the look of someone who had been crying in private for a long time. She had not yet decided whether to pursue legal action. She was afraid of destroying her relationship with her son. She kept saying that surely there was an explanation, that surely he had meant well, that surely if she just spoke with him directly they could work this out. I recognized every sentence. I had said all of them to myself. I told her what had helped me, and what had not. I told her that the most important thing I had learned was that protecting yourself is not the same as abandoning someone you love, that setting a boundary around what is yours is not an act of coldness but an act of honesty. I told her that the question was not whether she loved her son. It was whether he had shown her, through his actions, that he was capable of honoring that love. I do not know what Estelle decided. She thanked me when I left and held my hand for a moment at the door in the way that means something that words aren't quite equal to. I gave her Susan's card and Robert's card and told her to call either of them if she decided she wanted help. On my way home I stopped at Marvella's and we sat on her back porch for an hour and she gave me a biscuit, which I ate without apology, and we watched the evening come down over the neighborhood and did not talk about anything in particular. That, too, is a form of healing. The ordinary. The unspectacular. The continuity of being alive in a place that belongs to you, with people who chose to be there. The house on Maple Hill Road is 100 years old this year. I have been thinking about that. About all the life it has held and sheltered and witnessed since 1924. The families that came before Jean and me, whose names I found in old county records when Jean was doing the deed research in 1983, the Pattersons, who built it, and the Kellehers after them, and the widow Vance who sold it to us for a price that seemed generous and that we later understood was shaped by her wish for the house to go to people who would stay. She had watched us walk through twice before accepting our offer, this woman in her 80s who had lived there since the 1950s, and afterward she wrote us a note, which I have kept in the kitchen drawer all these years, that said only, "You have the right feel for it. Take care of the Hemlocks." Jean took care of the Hemlocks. And now I do. A house that is genuinely lived and accumulates something over time that is not quite memory and not quite presence but is some third thing that partakes of both. It is in the way the light moves through the rooms at different hours. It is in the worn patch on the third stair where 40 years of feet have passed. It is in the oak door frame with the two sets of initials, Lily's neat and deliberate, Cooper's slightly crooked and deeply sincere. Wayne looked at this house and saw an asset whose value could be liquidated. Pamela looked at it and saw a project, raw material for a kitchen renovation and an open-plan home office. Dale Pruitt looked at it and saw a commission. I look at it and see Jean on a Sunday morning with his newspaper. I see a 9-year-old Wayne building something with blocks in the front room that he knocked over in a rage when it fell and then, quietly, when he thought no one was watching, rebuilt. I see Lily at my kitchen table with her sketchbook and Cooper in the backyard arguing with his soccer ball and Marvella coming through the back gate with something wrapped in a dish towel that she made too much of and didn't want to waste. I see 40 years of a life that was built carefully and loved truly and that no forged signature, no listing at 12% below market value, no closing scheduled for a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, could simply unmake. They tried. That is the honest accounting. They tried, and they came very close, and it cost me 11 weeks and a summer of unwatered tomatoes and a grief I will carry in some form forever. But close is not the same as done. And the house stands. One of the things nobody tells you about elder financial abuse is how much of the fight is simply being believed. When I first told the nursing staff at Laurel Ridge that I wanted to speak with my attorney, I was met with the particular careful kindness of people who have been told that the patient is confused. When I first explained to Detective Delgado what had happened, I watched him listen with attention and without the slightly glazed patience that sometimes comes from people who assume that an elderly woman's account requires more verification than a younger person's would. When Patricia Webb submitted her findings and the court issued the injunction, what I felt alongside the relief was something I had not expected, the sheer novelty of being taken at my word. I am not a fragile person. I am not easily rattled and I am not given to self-pity. But there is something about navigating a serious medical crisis and then a legal battle simultaneously, at 72, that puts you in daily contact with the ways in which age becomes a lens through which people filter what you say. Your confusion is assumed before it is demonstrated. Your clarity requires proof. Your anger is gentle concern. Your certainty is the understandable but perhaps exaggerated reaction of someone who has been through a great deal. I want to be fair. Most of the people I dealt with throughout this process treated me with complete respect. Dr. Varma took me seriously. Robert took me seriously. Karen Ashby took me seriously. Detective Delgado took me seriously. Judge Moss, who read the full case file and addressed Wayne with the precise moral language the situation warranted, took me very seriously indeed. But the moments when I was not taken seriously, when the rehabilitation center staff hedged, when Wayne's first attorney sent a letter suggesting my recollection of events might be affected by the neurological trauma I had experienced, when a neighbor who knew about the case said, gently and with what I believe was genuine kindness, that she hoped I wasn't taking on too much stress given everything I'd been through. Those moments cost something. They required energy I had to spend on establishing the basic credibility of my own account before I could spend it on the account itself. I bring this up not to complain but because I think it is part of the honest telling. The legal mechanisms worked, eventually and well, because I had documentation and a forensic expert and an attorney who had known me for 3 decades and a private investigator who was thorough beyond what was required. Not every person in my situation has all of those things. Some people fight this battle without a Robert Fitch. Some people fight it without a Marvella. Some people fight it from a hospital bed without anyone who knows to look for a sign in a yard. If there is anything I want to leave you with beyond the satisfaction of a closing stopped and a house kept, it is this: the systems that are supposed to protect elderly people from financial exploitation work better when the elderly person in question has allies who are persistent and documentation that is thorough and the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept that what happened is simply the cost of getting old. Build your documentation. Find your allies. Refuse the premise that your age makes your judgment suspect and your assets available. And if someone tells you that you're being difficult, or that you're making things harder than they need to be, or that a woman your age really shouldn't be taking all of this on, look at them with the patient eyes of someone who has been doing hard things for 70+ years and say, watch me.